The call came through secure channels in late summer 2023. Not a request for a meeting. A direct phone call. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to Captain Ibrahim Traoré. That itself was unusual. Secretaries of Defense don't typically place personal calls to leaders of small African nations unless the situation is urgent and the message needs to be delivered with maximum weight. Austin was calling because standard diplomatic pressure wasn't working. Traoré had continued moving Burkina Faso away from Western security frameworks despite clear warnings from AFRICOM, despite consequences being applied through suspended assistance programs, despite back-channel messages from multiple Western allies. The Pentagon's assessment was that Traoré either didn't understand the seriousness of American concern or didn't care. Austin's call was designed to clarify both the concern and the stakes. Lloyd Austin brought particular credibility to this conversation. Not just a political appointee but a retired four-star general. Former CENTCOM commander. Combat veteran. Someone who understood military operations at the highest strategic level. When Austin spoke about security issues, he spoke with the authority of someone who had commanded American forces in the most complex theaters. He was also the first black Secretary of Defense in American history. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. When Austin spoke to African leaders, there was an implicit message: America understands your concerns, respects your perspective, and I personally represent that understanding at the highest levels of American power. It had been an effective tool in other conversations. But Traoré wasn't moved by symbolism. He evaluated arguments based on their strategic logic and their alignment with Burkina Faso's security needs. And he had a very clear analysis of why American security frameworks had failed in the Sahel and what needed to change. The call began with professional courtesy. Austin congratulating Traoré on recent tactical successes against insurgents. Acknowledging the difficult security environment. Expressing genuine respect for Burkina Faso's military efforts. This was Austin's style: establish rapport before delivering hard messages. Make clear that criticism comes from a place of understanding and shared purpose. Then he shifted to the substance. Captain Traoré, I want to speak directly about American concerns regarding Burkina Faso's evolving security partnerships. Specifically the engagement with Russian military personnel and the broader distancing from Western security cooperation. I understand the frustrations that have driven these decisions. The security situation in the Sahel has been extremely challenging. But I'm concerned that the direction you're taking could make things worse rather than better. He paused to let that sink in. Russian engagement in African security has a troubling track record. Wagner Group operations in Mali and CR have produced significant civilian casualties without delivering sustainable security improvements. The approach is transactional. They provide immediate tactical capabilities but don't build long-term institutional capacity. And they come with political costs that aren't always apparent immediately but become clear over time. Another pause. The United States, by contrast, is invested in genuine partnership. We want to see African nations develop independent security capabilities. We provide training, equipment, intelligence support, not to create dependency but to build capacity. But that partnership requires trust and cooperation. When that breaks down, we lose the ability to help even when we want to. It was a sophisticated argument. Acknowledging Traoré's grievances. Presenting Russian engagement as dangerous. Framing American assistance as capacity building rather than dependency creation. And implicitly warning that continued movement away from American frameworks would have consequences. Traoré listened without interrupting. When Austin finished, he responded with the directness that had characterized all his engagements with American officials. Secretary Austin, I appreciate the call and the directness. Let me respond with equal directness. You said Russian engagement has a troubling track record in Africa. I agree. Wagner operations in Mali have been problematic. But let me ask, what is the track record of American engagement in the Sahel? Because from where I sit, it's also troubling. Not because of the same problems Wagner has created, but because it hasn't delivered the security outcomes it promised. He continued before Austin could respond. You mentioned that America wants to build independent African security capabilities rather than create dependency. But Secretary Austin, we've been receiving American security assistance for over 15 years. If the goal was independent capability, why are we still dependent on American intelligence? American training? American equipment? Why haven't 15 years of capacity building produced the capacity to operate independently? The honest answer is that the assistance was never designed to create independence. It was designed to maintain cooperation with American strategic priorities. Which is fine, that's how great powers operate. But let's not pretend it's something else. Calling it capacity building when it's actually leverage creation is the kind of dishonesty that makes genuine partnership impossible. Austin tried to interject but Traoré continued. You said Russian engagement comes with political costs that aren't always apparent immediately. True. Every security partnership has costs. But American engagement also has political costs. When American-backed governments fail to deliver security or economic development, populations sometimes turn to insurgencies that position themselves as anti-American. That's a cost. When American counterterrorism operations create civilian casualties, even accidentally, that's a cost that strengthens insurgent recruitment. When American assistance comes with conditions about governance that are selectively enforced, that undermines government legitimacy. Those are political costs too. Austin's tone shifted slightly, still professional but more direct. Captain, I understand the critique. But what's the alternative you're proposing? Because from where I sit, you're moving toward partnerships that have demonstrably worse outcomes than American engagement, even with all the flaws you've identified. That doesn't make strategic sense unless there's something I'm missing. What you're missing, Secretary Austin, is that I'm not choosing Russian engagement over American engagement. I'm choosing Burkinabe priorities over both American and Russian priorities. I'm working with whoever provides capabilities that serve our security needs on terms we can accept. Sometimes that's Russia. Sometimes it's Turkey. Sometimes it's China. Sometimes it's France despite our complicated history. And sometimes it's America when your offers align with our needs. But I'm not subordinating our strategy to any single partner's framework. That's not sustainable. You can't play multiple powers against each other indefinitely, why not? That's exactly what successful small states have done throughout history. Switzerland, Singapore, various Gulf states. They've maintained independence by ensuring no single power could leverage assistance into control. It's risky. It requires constant balancing. But it's less risky than total dependence on one power whose interests might diverge from yours at any moment. Austin's voice hardened. Captain Traoré, let me be very clear about something. The United States has significant capabilities in Africa. AFRICOM operates across the continent. We have intelligence assets, drone capabilities, special operations presence, logistical infrastructure. If Burkina Faso is seen as actively working against American interests by empowering Russian presence in a strategic region, there will be consequences beyond suspended assistance programs. There will be active measures to protect American interests and American personnel. It was no longer diplomatic pressure. It was a direct threat. Active measures. That could mean anything from intelligence operations to support for opposition groups to direct military action if American personnel were threatened. Traoré's response was immediate and equally direct. Secretary Austin, are you threatening military action against Burkina Faso? I'm describing the full range of options available when American interests are threatened. By a sovereign nation making security decisions based on our own assessment of our security needs. Let me be equally clear about something, Burkina Faso is not working against American interests. We're working for Burkinabe interests. If those diverge from American interests, that's not hostility. That's independence. And if America responds to independence with active measures, then you're proving exactly what I've been saying. That American security partnerships are about American control, not African security. You're oversimplifying. No, you're threatening. There's a difference. You called to pressure me into aligning with American security frameworks by warning about Russian costs and American capabilities. I'm explaining why that pressure won't work. Not because I'm anti-American, but because I'm pro-Burkinabe. And because I've watched American security engagement in the Sahel for 15 years and seen it fail to deliver security. So when you threaten active measures if we don't comply, you're not making me more likely to comply. You're confirming that compliance is what this has always been about. Austin was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone was controlled but intense. You're playing a dangerous game, Captain. Burkina Faso is not Singapore or Switzerland. You don't have their economic resources or strategic position. You're a poor country fighting an insurgency with limited capabilities. Antagonizing the United States when you need external support is not strategic. It's reckless. And this is where Traoré's response became something Austin hadn't expected. Not defensive. Not conciliatory. But harder pressure applied back. Secretary Austin, you're right that Burkina Faso is poor. You're right that we're fighting with limited capabilities. But you know what we do have? Gold. Significant gold reserves. We're one of the top 10 gold producers globally. We also have manganese. And we're potentially sitting on lithium deposits that are increasingly valuable for the energy transition your country is pursuing. He continued. Right now, American and Western companies extract those resources under agreements that were negotiated when we had no leverage. They pay royalty rates well below international norms. They employ relatively few Burkinabe people. They repatriate profits through tax structures that minimize what stays in country. That arrangement has continued for decades because governments that challenged it faced consequences. But I'm not bound by fear of consequences that have already been applied. You've already suspended assistance. You've already applied diplomatic pressure. You're already threatening active measures. So what additional consequences am I supposed to fear that would prevent me from renegotiating resource agreements to terms that actually benefit Burkina Faso? Austin started to respond, but Traoré kept going. Here's what I'm prepared to do if American pressure continues. I will systematically review every mining contract with American or Western companies. I will demand royalty rates of 15% minimum, which is still below what many resource-rich countries receive but higher than the 8 to 12% we currently get. I will require that a percentage of extracted minerals be processed in Burkina Faso before export, creating local jobs and value addition. I will implement transfer pricing rules with actual enforcement to prevent profit shifting to tax havens. And I will make very clear that companies that cooperate with American political pressure against my government will find their contracts under particular scrutiny. You're threatening American corporate interests. I'm describing sovereign resource management. The same thing Norway does with oil. The same thing Chile does with copper. The same thing any country does when it decides that resources within its territory should primarily benefit its population. If American companies don't like the new terms, they can leave. And I can offer those contracts to Chinese, Russian, Turkish, or Gulf state companies that might accept terms more favorable to Burkina Faso. Your pressure gives me the political cover domestically to do things that would otherwise be risky. So please, continue threatening. It makes the resource renegotiation much easier to justify. The silence on the call was profound. Austin had called to apply pressure. To make clear the costs of continued movement away from American security frameworks. Instead, he'd been presented with a counter-pressure he hadn't anticipated. Traoré wasn't just resisting American pressure. He was threatening to use it as justification for resource nationalism that would harm American corporate interests in ways that couldn't be easily reversed through diplomatic or military action. Because you can suspend security assistance. You can even conduct covert operations. But you can't force a sovereign government to maintain favorable mining contracts without an outright invasion. And invading Burkina Faso over gold mining royalties was obviously absurd. Austin tried to de-escalate. Captain Traoré, I don't think threats are productive for either of us. I agree. So perhaps we should stop making them. You called to pressure me about security partnerships. I've explained why that pressure won't change my analysis. I've also explained that continued pressure will have consequences for American economic interests that might be more costly than the security concerns you're trying to address. So we have a choice. Continue a pressure campaign that will escalate in ways that harm both of us. Or find a different basis for engagement. What basis? Honest acknowledgement that American security engagement in the Sahel has not worked as designed. Genuine openness to alternative approaches that might work better even if they don't align perfectly with American frameworks. Acceptance that Burkina Faso will maintain relationships with multiple partners including some America doesn't like. And in exchange, I commit to genuine transparency about those relationships and continued cooperation on issues where our interests actually align rather than where you demand alignment. Austin was quiet for a long moment. I'll need to discuss this with the President and National Security Council. But I can tell you that what you're describing, resource nationalism combined with Russian security partnerships, will be seen as fundamentally hostile to American interests. Then America will need to decide whether treating sovereign resource management as hostile is worth the costs. Because I'm not bluffing about the mining contracts. You have 48 hours to signal whether this conversation leads to different engagement or escalated pressure. After that, I'm announcing a comprehensive review of all extractive industry contracts. And I'll make very clear that the review is happening because American political pressure made clear that current arrangements serve American interests more than Burkinabe interests. The call ended without resolution. Austin had tried to pressure Traoré into compliance through warnings about Russian partnerships and threats of active measures. Traoré had responded by threatening American corporate interests in ways that would be politically difficult for Washington to address without looking like they were defending corporate profits over sovereign rights. The pressure had been returned harder than it was applied. The 48 hours passed without a signal from Washington. Traoré had been clear about the deadline and the consequence. On the third day, he held a press conference in Ouagadougou. The announcement was delivered with the calm precision that had characterized all his public statements. Burkina Faso is initiating a comprehensive review of all contracts in the extractive industries sector, with particular focus on gold, manganese, and other mineral resources. This review will evaluate whether current agreements adequately serve the interests of the Burkinabe people and meet international standards for resource sovereignty. He continued without dramatic rhetoric. Just facts. Current royalty rates for gold extraction average between 8 and 12% of value. Comparable resource-rich nations receive between 15 and 25%. Current contracts require minimal local processing, meaning Burkina Faso exports raw materials rather than value-added products. Current employment requirements are weakly enforced, resulting in fewer Burkinabe jobs than the scale of operations should generate. This review will determine new minimum standards. Companies willing to renegotiate contracts under these standards will be welcomed as partners. Those unwilling will be invited to conclude operations in an orderly manner so contracts can be offered to other investors. The international reaction was immediate. Mining industry associations issued statements about investment climate and rule of law. Credit rating agencies warned about sovereign risk. Western financial media ran stories about resource nationalism and political instability. But Traoré had anticipated all of it. And he had public support. Because he'd framed it not as anti-Western ideology but as basic fairness. 40 tons of gold leaving annually. Burkina Faso remaining desperately poor. The math was simple enough that ordinary people understood immediately. Within 72 hours of the announcement, the U.S. State Department issued a formal statement expressing concern about arbitrary changes to investment agreements and warning about consequences for bilateral relations. The statement was carefully worded to avoid explicitly defending corporate profits, but the message was clear: America was not pleased. But something unexpected happened. The pressure campaign that was supposed to isolate Traoré instead created opportunities. China's Ministry of Commerce issued a statement expressing interest in mutually beneficial investment partnerships based on respect for sovereignty. Turkey's government signaled openness to mining investments under revised terms. Gulf state sovereign wealth funds indicated willingness to discuss resource partnerships. The diversification Traoré had threatened became real. Because other powers saw an opportunity to enter a market that had been dominated by Western companies. And they were willing to accept higher royalty rates and local processing requirements that Western companies called unreasonable. 2 weeks after Traoré's announcement, a senior State Department official requested an urgent meeting. Not in Washington. Not in Ouagadougou. Dakar, Senegal. Neutral territory. The official came with a clear message: the mining contract review needed to stop or be modified in ways that protected American corporate interests. Traoré came with a counter-message: the review would continue, but America could influence the outcome by changing its approach to security engagement. The meeting was tense from the start. Captain Traoré, you've created a significant crisis in bilateral relations. American companies have operated in Burkina Faso for decades under agreements that were legally negotiated and properly executed. Unilaterally changing those terms is not how responsible governments behave. Traoré's response was measured. Were they properly negotiated? Or were they negotiated under conditions where Burkina Faso had no leverage because we were dependent on Western security assistance and economic support? Because those look like different things. That's not relevant to the contracts, it's entirely relevant. When you negotiate under duress or dependency, the resulting agreement reflects power imbalance, not mutual benefit. I'm correcting that imbalance. Exactly as your own country did when it renegotiated trade agreements it felt no longer served American interests. The State Department official tried a different approach. What you're doing will harm Burkina Faso more than American companies. Investment will dry up. Credit will become more expensive. Development will slow. Possibly. But maybe not. Because there are other investors willing to accept different terms. And even if investment slows temporarily, having 15% of future gold revenue is better than having 10% of current revenue if it means we're actually developing independent economic capacity. You're gambling with your country's future, no. I'm gambling that sovereignty is worth more than subordination. Even if sovereignty is economically costly in the short term. Because subordination has costs too. Permanent costs that don't show up in investment figures but matter enormously for long-term development. The meeting continued for hours. The State Department official trying various forms of pressure. Traoré responding with the same core logic: Burkina Faso would set terms for its own resources, and external pressure would not change that. Finally, the official made an offer. What if we broker a compromise? American companies agree to higher royalties, say 13%. Some increased local employment. In exchange, you end the broader contract review and commit to maintaining stable investment terms going forward. Traoré shook his head. 13% is still below international norms. And it doesn't address local processing requirements or transfer pricing issues. More importantly, it proves my point. The only reason American companies are offering 13% now is because I threatened to demand 15% and invite Chinese competition. If I accept 13%, I've left value on the table that I could get by actually following through. You risk losing American investment entirely, then I lose it. And gain Chinese or Turkish or Gulf investment instead. Possibly on better terms because those investors are trying to enter a market rather than maintain dominance in one. You keep framing this as if American investment is irreplaceable. It's not. It's one option among several. And maybe not the best option if the terms aren't competitive. The Dakar meeting ended without agreement. The State Department official returned to Washington with an assessment that Traoré would not be moved by economic pressure and that following through on threats might backfire by opening the market to competitors. 3 weeks after the Dakar meeting, Lloyd Austin called again. The tone was different from the first call. Less pressure. More negotiation. Captain Traoré, I've been authorized to discuss a different approach. The President has reviewed the situation and believes there may be space for a reset in our relationship. But it requires movement on both sides. I'm listening. The United States is prepared to accept that Burkina Faso will maintain diverse security partnerships, including some we're not comfortable with. We won't demand exclusive alignment. In exchange, we want transparency about those partnerships and continued cooperation on counterterrorism intelligence where our interests overlap. And on the mining contracts? That's more complicated. The companies are private entities. We can't dictate their negotiations. But we can signal that we won't treat contract renegotiations as a hostile act requiring diplomatic response. Which gives you space to negotiate directly with companies without U.S. government interference. That's not enough. I need the U.S. government to actively support higher royalty rates as being in line with international best practices. Make clear that Burkina Faso seeking 15% royalties is reasonable, not radical. That removes the political risk companies face if they agree to new terms. Austin was quiet for a moment. That's asking us to actively support something that harms American corporate interests. It's asking you to acknowledge that sovereign resource management is legitimate. If American companies can't be competitive under fair terms, that's a market outcome, not a political problem. After a long pause, I can't promise that. But I can promise that we won't actively oppose it. We'll stay neutral on the contract negotiations. Let market forces determine outcomes. And if American companies respond by trying to destabilize my government through other means? I can't control what private companies do. But I can tell you that any operations on Burkinabe territory involving American personnel or contractors will be coordinated with AFRICOM, and AFRICOM will not support destabilization operations. That's as much assurance as I can provide. Traoré considered this carefully. And on security assistance? What changes? We restore intelligence sharing on counterterrorism. We don't demand you cut Russian ties, but we expect transparency about what they're doing. We resume some training programs on a case-by-case basis where there's mutual interest. And we stop treating your independent security decisions as hostile acts requiring response. In exchange, you don't actively undermine American interests. You don't position Burkina Faso as a Russian base of operations. You maintain communication channels so we understand your strategic thinking even when we disagree with it. And you give American companies fair consideration in the contract renegotiations, not preferential treatment, but fair consideration alongside other bidders. Traoré was silent, calculating. This was more than he'd expected to get from the pressure campaign. Not everything he wanted, but genuine movement from the position Austin had started with. I can agree to those terms with one addition. When American officials discuss African security publicly, you acknowledge that local approaches sometimes work better than external frameworks. You don't need to criticize past American strategy explicitly. But you stop dismissing African independent security policies as reckless or illegitimate. Austin laughed slightly. You want me to admit you were right. I want you to create space for other African leaders to pursue independent strategies without automatic American opposition. Because if this approach works in Burkina Faso, others will want to try similar things. And they shouldn't face the full pressure of American opposition just for trying to solve their own problems their own way. After a pause, I can't promise how others will talk about this. But in my own statements, I can acknowledge that security strategies need to fit local contexts and that one size doesn't fit all. That's as far as I can go. That's enough. We have an agreement. The understanding that emerged from the Austin-Traoré exchanges became a template. Not publicized formally. Not a treaty or written agreement. But an operational framework that changed how America and Burkina Faso engaged. Intelligence sharing resumed, but with clear boundaries about what was shared and what wasn't. Training programs restarted on specific tactical issues where both sides saw value. American companies renegotiated mining contracts, most accepting higher royalties and increased local processing requirements rather than losing access to reserves entirely. And crucially, Austin stopped framing Burkina Faso's independent security approach as a problem requiring American response. In subsequent congressional testimony and public statements, he described it as a local approach adapted to specific challenges that we're monitoring but not opposing. 6 months after the final Austin-Traoré call, a mining industry conference in London featured a panel on African resource sovereignty. A representative from an American mining company that had renegotiated its Burkina Faso contract was asked whether the higher royalty rates were sustainable. His answer was revealing. We're paying 15% royalties now versus 10% before. But we're operating in a more stable political environment because the government has legitimacy from visibly prioritizing national interests. The stability is worth more than the royalty increase costs us. And frankly, if we hadn't renegotiated, we'd have lost the contracts entirely to Chinese competitors willing to accept those terms. So it was a good business decision even if it wasn't our preferred outcome. The comment captured what had changed. American companies had accepted that they couldn't maintain favorable terms through political pressure. The U.S. government had accepted that some African leaders would pursue independent strategies and that opposing them was costlier than accommodating them. And Traoré had demonstrated that pressure could be countered with counterpressure if you understood leverage and were willing to accept risk. Years later, when asked about the Austin exchanges, Traoré said, "Secretary Austin called to pressure me into compliance with American security preferences. He threatened consequences. Active measures. Diplomatic isolation. I responded by threatening American corporate interests in ways that couldn't be easily addressed through the tools he was threatening to use. He could cut security assistance. But he couldn't force me to maintain favorable mining contracts without actions that would be politically impossible for America to justify. So we ended up negotiating. Not because either of us changed our fundamental position, but because we both realized escalation would be costly for both sides. That's not friendship. That's mutual recognition of leverage. And it's a more honest basis for engagement than pretending partnership when one side is trying to subordinate the other. Did I pressure back harder than he pressured me? Yes. Because I had to. Responding to pressure with capitulation just invites more pressure. Responding with counterpressure that the other side can't easily address forces negotiation. And negotiation between parties with different forms of leverage can produce better outcomes than subordination disguised as partnership. Secretary Austin is a serious person. Once he realized the pressure campaign would cost more than accommodation, he adapted. That's what good strategists do. They assess costs and benefits and adjust accordingly. I respect that. What I wouldn't respect is if he'd continued pressuring even after it became clear it wouldn't work and would be costly. That would be ego over strategy. He chose strategy. So we found terms we could both live with.